Today's sponsor is Datadog, a real-time monitoring platform that unifies metrics, logs, and distributed traces from your cloud containers and orchestration software. Datadog's container-centric monitoring features allow you to track the health and performance of your dynamic container environment. The Container Map provides a bird's-eye view of your container fleet, and the Live Container View searches, groups, and filters your containers with any criteria, like tags, pods, or workspaces. To start monitoring your container clusters, sign up for a free trial today, and Datadog will send you a free t-shirt. Visit datadog.com/container-cloudcast to get started. That's datadog.com/container-cloudcast.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Middle of February 2022, getting near Valentine's Day. For those of you that are looking to do something nice with your significant other, and hope everybody's doing well. We are doing well here. Things are starting to bloom here in North Carolina, which means it may sound slightly nasally because it means allergy season is starting to kick in, which is about a lovely two-month-ish adventure for us here in North Carolina. So hope everybody's doing well. This is another Sunday Perspective show. We're going to dig into, we did some shows last year that got a lot of good uptake, a lot of good feedback. And so we're around what we called sort of lessons learned from. And we had dug into a number of topics. In a lot of cases, we dug into some technologies that, had started off with a ton of progress, a ton of hype and so forth. So we talked about Docker, we talked about Cloud Foundry, we talked about OpenStack, and some other things like that. I think there was a couple others that we did as well. And I got to thinking, based on a number of conversations that I've had over the last couple of months, sort of, lessons learned from, and I think the topic I want to use today is sort of shadow IT. And I want to look at a little bit of how we got to even talking about shadow IT, what drove it, and then what sort of evolved from that and how it impacts IT budgets, IT decision making, architecture decisions, a whole bunch of stuff that sort of come out of that. We tend to look at how much money is the cloud making and all those sort of things. But I kind of want to look back at how we got there and sort of where are we today? Because I think it still exists. It's still a real thing. We don't necessarily call it shadow IT anymore, but it's still a very real thing where groups outside of sort of what you'd call central IT make a lot of decisions. They have impact over a lot of budget in organizations, and but then there's these sort of trickle down things that happen to the central IT group as a result of that. So kind of want to dive into that, dig into that a little bit more. We'll do that right after the break. Managing secure access to cloud resources is getting more complex, and a misconfiguration can easily turn into a major breach. That's why there's Teleport. Teleport is the easiest, most secure way to access your cloud infrastructure. The open source Teleport Access Plane consolidates everything you need for secure access to your Windows and Linux servers, Kubernetes clusters, databases, and internal applications like AWS Management Console, Jenkins, GitLab, Grafana, and much more. Teleport's unique approach is not only more secure, it also improves developer productivity. Download Teleport today at goteleport.com/cloudcast. That's goteleport.com/cloudcast. Today's show is sponsored by CloudZero. For software-driven companies focused on growing margins, CloudZero is the only cloud cost intelligence platform that puts engineering in control by connecting technical decisions to business results. By analyzing cloud services like AWS and Snowflake, CloudZero provides real-time cost insights that help you maximize margins. Engineering teams can answer critical questions like, who are my most expensive customers? How much does this specific feature cost our business? What's the cost impact of re-architecting this application? With cost anomaly alerts via Slack, product-specific data views, and granular engineering context that makes it easy to investigate any cost, CloudZero is your complete cloud cost intelligence platform, connecting the dots between high-level trends and individual line items. Join companies like Drift, Rapid7, and SeatGeek by visiting cloudzero.com/cloudcast to get started today. That's cloudzero.com/cloudcast. And we're back. And, as I mentioned at the top of the show, I kind of want to dive into both, what created shadow IT, and then we'll talk about some of the nuances that happen for those of you that are maybe younger and didn't live through some of this. And then we'll kind of talk about, what's been the ramifications of that movement, what happened, why did it happen, Why do we have the things that we have in our industry today? And then what are some of the ramifications of it? Because it by no means has been a sort of clear divide between what happens, in quote unquote IT groups and non-IT groups, line of business, individual projects, and so on and so forth. So I thought what we'd do is sort of start a little bit of history, a little bit of context, how we got to where we were. And, I'm sure if you really went back and looked at a lot of things, there was shadow IT things happening well back before any of the things that we really think of as the cloud were happening. So for those of you that are a little bit younger, number one, we used to go into the office, which I know hasn't really happened for a lot of people in the last couple of years. We used to go in the office, and two of the most common things that were shadow IT at the time were, number one, somebody would want to work on something, and it used to be very, very difficult to get a compute resource from central IT to get something into their data centers, to get it into a rack. And so it wasn't unusual to have an individual group or an individual actually bring a computer into the office. Sort of the sort of thing was there's a server under Bill's desk, and that thing was doing something, right? Bill might have used it for some sort of project. You might have used it to run an application that some little work group used to use. So that was very not unusual. It happened all the time. And then the second thing that happened a lot was as wireless technologies, especially things like Linksys and some others, kind of came to the forefront. Again, they were oftentimes being used as consumer technologies, but people would bring them in. And the reason they would do that is, as we moved from having desktop computers to laptop computers, and I know this is all dating itself and sounds old and dusty, but that was a big thing to be able to go, oh, I have a laptop computer. And a lot of times our group gets together in a conference room, and it's a real hassle to have to bring your Ethernet cable and hope there's a hub or a switch or something in that room so that we could all kind of plug in and keep working and do our meeting and maybe collaborate. And so it wasn't unusual for somebody to, bring one of those little Linksys type of devices into a corner office or a corner conference room, and people could just sort of, they would then plug it into the corporate network, and you'd have sort of local Wi-Fi. And it was again, it was mostly used so that you could pick up your laptop, not have to move your docking station, your cable. And so, if you think about those things in the most basic sense, those were there for productivity, right? People were like, well, I would love IT to do this for us, but they're not down with it, right? Or maybe the technology is too expensive, or I don't know what it was, but gosh, I can figure this basic thing out, and it's going to just make my life that much easier in the office. And that was really the original kind of shadow IT. And what it did was it really sort of highlighted not that IT was bad, not that IT wasn't productive, but it was mostly, those things were useful to people. They were going to make, workers productive, but they didn't raise to the level of priority for, the other things that IT had to do, which was, get your ERP system running, get your email system running, get your CRM system running, get, maybe a VPN system running so the executives could log in from their homes or whatever it was, right? There was tons of projects going on, but those things weren't, they just didn't raise to the level, or maybe there was some sort of security concern or whatever it was. So we sort of have had this thing for a long time, literally almost 2 decades now of, hey, I would like to do something that's going to make my job more productive, make my group more productive. We can get things done. And oh, by the way, I can figure out the technology, right? Like I don't need central IT to set things up for me. Like I can kind of figure it out, and I can probably afford it. And, or our group is willing to afford it because, it drives top line growth, or it drives productivity, or it drives whatever. So we've had this thing around for a while. And that went on for a while. And then, if we go back kind of historically, so, that kind of was around 2000-ish or so, those types of devices and those things came out. And then, after the economic crash, the housing crash of 2008, what we saw was, an explosion of services that were now being delivered out of the cloud. And part of that was because, innovation drives, difficult situations drive innovation. So a lot of stuff just popped up. But also, you had a lot of IT organizations who, were struggling and were going, gosh, how are we going to afford things, right? Because, you had this huge economic collapse. And so the opportunity to start doing some things that even though they didn't have all the features and all the bells and whistles, they were willing to go, oh, wow, this is a really cheap way to store data, or this is a really inexpensive way to get computing resources, or whatever it might have been, right? And so, not only did we see kind of the beginnings of AWS, again, 2006, 2007, 2008, and again, kind of coinciding with the economic crash of 2008, but we also saw SaaS take off. And so now all of a sudden, you didn't even have to set up that server on your desk. You could get a server out in the wild. You could get, some sort of application thing that would, maybe you didn't like using the corporate CRM system, or maybe the corporate ERP or CRM system or whatever it was a really expensive seat license. And you could go out to something like Salesforce.com and get a cheap seat license and be able to, spoof the system and be able to, do something for what you had to do, whatever that might have been. So again, we saw, the technology evolve. We saw these things evolve. And so where we are today, if we really look at it, is, we're now at a point where everybody has the ability to get access to, literally almost any technology. Maybe you can't get access to a supercomputer or, a 500 node GPU system or thing, but mostly you can get access to any technology, whether that's via open source, free and open source software, something in the public cloud. It could be a free tier in the public cloud. It could just be a service in the public cloud, or some sort of freemium service, a SaaS service that you can get for 30 days, or, you can get it for, 1 or 2 seats or something. So, the technology has become tremendously democratized. Okay, great. So, we've evolved a lot from where we were 10, 15, 20 years ago, where, the IT department had all of the smarts, they had all the budget, they controlled access in and out. The second thing that sort of happened in that was people started working remotely. And I know right now we're all going, oh, well, this big movement's happened. We all work remotely now. And this is a new phenomenon. People able to work outside of San Francisco or work outside of Seattle or whatever it is. But there was a trend that happened before this one, right? So there was a thing back in the early 2000s and in the mid 2000s where, people were able to work remotely, and VPNs were a thing. People were able to, they mostly worked remotely at night, right? So you would go, you'd work all day, and then your company would go, here's a way to remotely log in so you can keep doing more work. And I know people are going to complain and they're going to go, that's bad work-life balance. But that was a thing, right? Because we also had stuff going on where work was getting outsourced to other parts of the world. Maybe it was being outsourced to Asia or Eastern Europe or wherever it was being outsourced. And so, you had office hours that were not going to be 9 to 5 on the East Coast or 9 to 5 on the West Coast or whatever they're going to be. So the expectation was, you could work remotely, except this was just sort of doubling the amount of work you did. So, what that meant was, we had to start thinking about the boundaries of what the business looked like being kind of fragmented, right? The boundaries were no longer headquarters. They were no longer everybody worked in one location. It was people work in remote locations. And so again, that sort of fragmented the boundary of what IT looked like. It fragmented the boundary of where work was. And you contribute, you kind of put that together with, the rise of the most basic services in the public cloud, whether they were SaaS or IaaS or PaaS. And so now all of a sudden, everybody had a greater level of flexibility, right? The second piece is everybody, now has the ability to learn something. And, again, sometimes it's hard to put this stuff into context because nowadays, you can learn anything you want on YouTube or on Khan Academy or on ACloudGuru, or there's a developer evangelist around your favorite open source project. That was pretty rare, right? YouTube didn't have the massive set of people just putting random knowledge out there and showing you how to walk through things, and people showing you how to do this. Blogging wasn't necessarily a massive thing. So, we now have this thing where everybody, for maybe even a couple $100 can learn anything you want. You can set up any sort of environment that you want. And again, it's at a very minimal cost, right? And maybe $1,000 is expensive for you, and I understand that. But again, we're not talking about having to buy, I know people who used to buy tens of thousands of pieces of equipment to be able to just get a certification, and they would have to maintain that equipment in their house, and they would have to deal with the electrical stuff. And, so we've seen, that trend really evolve, and the technology's evolved and so forth. And cloud's been really, really helpful for that, but open source has been really helpful for that. But there were foundational things that drove the reason that Shadow IT happened, which was I can work in some place outside of my office. The technology is available. I can figure it out, and I can sort of augment what I do. Now, the result of that is, and this has been going on for a number of years, this wasn't like a one-time thing. This, like I talked about, was all sort of early 2000s. Then you had, the sort of famous seminal Mark Andreessen "Software's Eating the World" article in the Wall Street Journal, 2011. You had people like Nicholas Carr writing a book called "Does IT Matter?" where they basically were like, look, the things that IT used to do, things like CRM systems and ERPs and email systems, everybody has those now. And so they're no longer a differentiation for your business. Having a website is no longer a differentiation. Having an intranet versus an external facing thing, they're no longer differentiations. And so there's been this movement going on of, do we really need all these centralized things, or should we give people more flexibility, right? So this has been going on for more than a decade, probably more than 15 years. Even Gartner, who a lot of people think of as old and stodgy and, very traditional in their ways and very IT-centric, started coming up with this idea of something called bimodal IT. And what they were trying to figure out was, the central buyers don't have as much say in architecture. They don't have as much ability to dictate everything that a company does because of, again, a lot of these things that happened in the years before. And they were trying to come up with some way of basically saying, well, IT still very much matters, but the things that they do may not seem as sexy. They may not seem as innovative. They may not seem as forward-looking, but they're really important for the business, right? The business still needs a functioning website. They still need, to be able to do supply chain. They need to be able to work with their partners. They need to be able to, all have all sorts of stuff that you just need. I mean, we sort of take them for granted sometimes now, but those systems need to be in place. But, there were things that were then going to differentiate the business, some great new application, some way of using AI or ML or data lakes or whatever it was going to be, right? Whatever it was going to be, that was going to be sort of the other mode of IT. And what I think they got right was the recognition that those are very distinct things. What I don't know that they got right was that second thing, the non-sort of traditional stuff, was going to be IT, right? Now, is it IT in the technology sense? Absolutely. Was it IT in the sense of like it's another group in IT? Not really. I think what's sort of panned out is those have become lines of business. Those have become, groups and centers of excellence and all sorts of things that are, hey, we don't need to call ourselves IT. We're tied to the business. We're tied to driving the top line of the business. We're tied to being the new face of the business, being the new way of driving revenue or whatever that might be. So we have seen very much a bifurcation. They just haven't necessarily been purely IT bifurcations. Now, from an IT perspective, what that ultimately means is, the IT organizations, that sort of centralized IT organization, have less influence over company-wide architectures and strategies, right? So if you had been in this business for a while, you remember the days when, you went to that one group and a series of 7 or 8 enterprise architects would show up at your, show up in a meeting and they would be, sort of the on high from the ivory tower group of people who were going to dictate the future of how everything was going to get done in the organization, security strategies and how we're going to manage data and what our networks were going to look like and, the programming languages that we used and the frameworks and which databases we used and which vendors and which APIs and all these sort of things were kind of predefined. And then every group had to sort of align to that. Well, they have far less influence now. I saw a survey from, I think it was IDC. I have to find where, I think it was Matt Eastwood have it. I'll try and put a link in the show notes. But basically said of all the groups that influence where buying of technology goes, public cloud probably has more influence. It's around 25 or 30% of 5 or 6 different things, more so than central IT or even traditional vendor or other sorts of things. So we've sort of seen that shift happen. But the flip side of that is, we still see IT groups getting tasked sort of secondarily. Maybe sometimes they don't necessarily wish they had to do this, but then being tasked with, hey, this other group, this line of business, this whatever, center of excellence, this skunkworks project, they went and built an application. They went and built it in the public cloud, or they leveraged 5 or 6 different cloud services and APIs and so forth. But they're not necessarily prepared to manage this thing at scale. They're not necessarily prepared to keep it in compliance with what we have to do as a healthcare provider or a pharma provider or an automotive provider or whatever it might be, or operate it in this country. So we're going to need you guys to take that over. right? Or to sort of augment what they do. And so we're now seeing this weird thing happen where, IT used to make the rules and application groups used to struggle with it. And now we see the application groups doing the buying, making the decisions about what gets done. And then IT sort of, in some cases, not all cases, but some cases has to sort of take over and manage that. And you get the weird sort of like, what are we taking over? What are we dealing with here? And so that becomes, again, an even more challenging thing for IT is, do I push this thing back towards the corporate standards that we've been trying to dictate for certain things? Do I want to let them continue to have the flexibility they have because they're showing top line growth for the business, or they're driving, a new persona for our company and the face of our business out into the marketplace, whatever, right? They're in a weird position. There's not really a right answer to it, but there's some conflict there. There's some tension. There's some friction. And then the last piece that's kind of been interesting to watch is, we're seeing IT leaders kind of asked to drive digital transformation, and again, they might be doing it directly. They might be doing it with these sort of external groups that are external to their central IT, but still part of the business. And we used to see CIOs stay for 5+ years because their job was, hey, come in, implement SAP, implement this new CRM, ERP system. We know those take a long time. Come in, implement those things, get them running, drive new productivity or ROI for the business. And then people would go, oh, I've done that. It's on my resume. I'm going to go to the next company and go do that. Well, now we see these digital transformation things, and the timing of these is like 2 years, right? Like, hey, we've been tasked with moving our whole business to the cloud within 2 years or 3 years or something like that. So you have this even more condensed time frame in which IT is being asked to push things. And oh, by the way, most of the time, in order to be successful with that, you're going to have to push some cultural change too. So whether it's called DevOps or DevSecOps or FinOps or AIOps or whatever mashing together of two words that didn't necessarily work together before, that's going to be part of your charter too. You have to sort of drive that and implement that and get the right incentives in place. And oh, by the way, you probably got to do that in 2 years. And so that makes things, again, even more difficult from hey, Shadow IT just gets to go do whatever they want, whatever you call Shadow IT. And I'm over here still having to deal with rules and norms and compliance and process and other stuff. And so, IT gets somewhat frustrated by those things. Now, last sort of things we'll sort of talk about, because again, where this sort of evolves to, if we look at it in the bigger picture of things is, we sort of had Shadow IT, and then we had like, does IT matter? And then we ended up having bimodal IT. And what that sort of evolved into was, words like hybrid cloud and multi-cloud. And, there's some other reasons why those words kind of popped up and why they get discussed. But the reality is, you can make arguments, and there's lots of people that make good arguments for, hey, if you're going to go to the cloud, you should be all in on one cloud, right? It's the whole theory of, hey, if you're going to learn one environment, learn it the best you can. A lot of these clouds, again, pick whatever cloud you want. They seem to offer sort of everything. So, you're not making a wrong choice by picking one versus the other. But, if you think that you can just sort of understand everything about Azure and everything about Google and everything about Salesforce, like it's a lot of environments to learn. Maybe you should just learn one, right? So there's some reality to that argument, and I understand why people make that argument. But the reality is, there are things that are hybrid, and there are things that are multi-cloud. Now, I think the reality is, if we're honest with ourselves in 2022, there really aren't necessarily hybrid applications in the sense of, hey, the exact same application will just run in a bunch of cloud environments. That was sort of the mantra, the mindset, because the thought process was, vendor or customers are going to want to avoid vendor lock-in, and they're going to kind of play the cloud vendors off against one another. And so the reality is we are seeing a lot of hybrid applications being built, right? And what that means is some aspect of it runs in some cloud. Maybe it's the computing aspect of it, the way it scales, maybe where certain data services run. But that kind of complete application, the complete experience somebody has, is oftentimes augmented with API calls to third-party services. It could be web front end. It could be an authentication service. It could be a whole bunch of things, right? So we do see hybrid applications, just maybe not exactly in the same way that the industry sort of talked about. Well, this is what hybrid will look like, sort of on-prem and in the public cloud, right? We also, as much as a segment of the industry sort of bemoans the term multi-cloud, the reality is most companies, whether you're even small business or larger business, you're oftentimes multi-cloud. What that means is you're using a lot of cloud services. Now, the reality is you're probably not necessarily using them all in coordination. You're sort of using them as islands, right? So you've got certain things running in this SaaS service and other things running in this SaaS service. You might be using, a service like Okta to authenticate across a bunch of your services. You might be using Google primarily for, let's say, data services. Maybe you're using AWS for your compute stuff, and maybe you're still doing, your Office 365 stuff in Microsoft. And to a certain extent, that's multi-cloud. Now, let's forget all the semantics of what's hybrid and what's multi and whether you like it or whether you don't or whatever. If we come back to sort of the original thing, which was how does this impact IT and how much of those things happening, those distribution of IT services happening, who's responsible for them, right? And, it's wonderful to say, well, you built it, you run it. But the reality is people love to build. Not a lot of people love to run. And a lot of people don't love to maintain. And so now that's sort of where we are with IT, right? The idea of single panes of glass, very, very difficult when the IT function itself has already been distributed. So there's probably not going to be one single pane that oversees all that. The clouds, while they do have some commonality between them, and you can figure out how common or consistent you want to be between them, you're probably not going to see one single pane of glass. You're probably not going to see one group be responsible for that. But we do see this trend where IT keeps getting pulled back in, keeps getting pulled back in, getting pulled back in. And so, if we think about sort of lessons learned, well, that's where we are, right? Anytime you start to distribute stuff, yes, we do tend to see things get distributed and come back and be centralized, and then just get distributed and then centralized and so forth. And so we've seen those trends. I think we talked about those, for the last 15, 20 minutes. But we're now at a point where we're in sort of a weird state where the applications are distributed. The cloud services that we use, again, those could be stuff that we do on-prem or stuff in the public cloud. But who manages those is sort of this weird thing, right? So the applications are centralized. The management is sort of this weird kind of like, hey, it'd be nice if it was centralized because there's probably some things that we could benefit from, security or policy or authentication, identification, all those sort of things. But that's really hard to do when we're using a lot of these different tools. And I think the nature is right now, with the pace of change of technology happening so fast, it is very, very hard to completely centralize. I don't think we'll necessarily get the genie back in the bottle of everything being centralized. I think that's, something else would have to happen at a macro level, huge economic disruption or, another pandemic or something that we probably don't want to talk about to get us back to maybe more centralized. But I think the way we have to think about things is what do you do when, central IT has allowed a lot of things to happen, right? The businesses realized that productivity value, that flexibility was valuable to the business. And I think IT is really trying to figure out for themselves as centralized groups within organizations, how do we deal with this? And I think that's, probably at the center of a lot of questions that people ask themselves. I know it's a conversation that I have with a lot of different companies day in and day out, and there's no easy answers. But I think, we think about how we've evolved from, the original question of, does IT matter? Right? Software's eating the world. Does IT matter? Literally, that was a question that was asked, 15 years ago. IT, I think, very much matters, but I think its role is kind of being redefined, and I think there's opportunities to figure out what is the best way to do that. And I don't know that there's best practices yet. I think it's a difficult situation anytime you have this sort of mix and match of central and decentralized, but. Anyways, hopefully that was somewhat useful, especially as we think about how do we get where we are and what are the opportunities? What are the opportunities to be either helping those application teams to build better applications, but maybe do it in a way that, long term it can be maintained if that's a goal of that application, but also thinking about, if what you do is work with IT teams, if you're part of an IT team, how do you think about these sort of centralized versus decentralized sort of situations? And I'd love to get your feedback, love to hear how you all are dealing with it, what struggles you're having with it. It might help us, create the next set of shows that we have coming out here. But sometimes I feel like it's useful to sort of go, how do we get where we are, right? What's the state of where we are? And hopefully this stuff's been useful for you. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Unlike some of the other shows, the Docker show or OpenStack or whatever, this doesn't have sort of an ending. The Docker show is actually, now that we look at it, we've seen some numbers out of Docker and Mirantis and so forth that business is starting to poke its head up above the ground again. So congratulations to them. But IT tends to be cyclical. It comes and goes. It's centralized. It's decentralized. It has ebbs and flows. And this sort of shadow IT way of decentralizing IT is definitely had ebbs and flows. So with that, I'm going to kind of wrap it up. I hope everybody's doing well. Hope you're having a great February. Again, thank everybody for listening to the show. Thanks for telling a friend. Thanks for helping us grow and telling the community about it, telling 2 friends, telling 5 friends, posting about it, tweeting at us, all those sort of good things. As always, thanks for giving us reviews in the places that you listen to the podcast. We've got a lot of really nice 5-star reviews and some good feedback to the email alias and everything. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.